Hey everyone, you're here starting with coding, and in today's video we are working with more questions from this week. So it's a new week and there's new questions, but nothing new to me because again, most of all these questions that I get, I've received them multiple times over the years. So the first question that we're going to go over is a very common one, and I've mentioned this one in many videos before. And so the customer called, and her problem was she was sewing, and she noticed that her fabric, like the part that had already been sewn, and it was just a simple straight stitch really, and so the part of the fabric that had been sewn was quite wavy. So there are a number of things that can cause this issue. But another issue she was also having was not only was her fabric wavy after it had been sewn, like it had been stretched, but she wasn't working with a knit. But another issue is the fabric wasn't feeding as properly. Like it hesitated, like it just wasn't wanting to go underneath the foot, especially like over like a small seam or something like that. Issues that you really shouldn't be encountering with Bernina. So some of the things that can cause this is one, if you're working with stretchy fabric, of course, it can stretch as being pushed underneath the foot. So you can adjust your pressure foot pressure to help with when you're working with fabric on the bias and when you're working with knit fabric and fabric that has a tendency to stretch. But basically what her issue was is she was using a D foot, but she didn't have her dual feet engaged. So as you should know from other videos or just from sewing, is when you're working with a foot, like for instance here, so here's a 1D. So the foot, all the Bernina feet have a number, and a lot of them have a letter, either a C or a D. There are a few, there's a 2A foot out there, there's a 3B foot out there, but those are different, those are outliers. But the C and the D stand for the code, the C stands for the code, and the D stands for this cutout in the back. So as I always mention, is when you are working with a D foot, that's a foot with a cutout in the back and the letter D on it, you must engage your dual feet. Because what's happening is you've got this cutout in the back of your foot, which is designed for the dual feed to be in that cutout, helping pull that fabric. But if that dual feed is not engaged, then the fabric isn't going to pull evenly. So that could cause some hesitation, especially over seams. It doesn't even have to be that bulky of a seam, but especially over seams, especially when you work with fabric that likes to stretch. So what was happening with this customer's fabric and why the fabric was wavy is there was nothing applying pressure to those back center feed dogs. And so the fabric was stitching just with this regular straight stitch, but what's happening is that fabric was being pulled back to the foot because there was nothing holding it in place. And that was causing either narrower stitches, but it was also causing that fabric to get that wave, causing that fabric to look like it's being stretched, because in actuality it was slightly stretching and it wasn't flattening out. Now, wavy fabric that's caused by not using the dual feed or having that dual feed engaged usually can be pressed out just with your iron, especially if you add a little steam to it. Usually it presses out perfectly fine. But sometimes we don't always have the ability to iron it or to steam it. But basically you want to prevent that from happening. And all it was is she didn't have her dual feed engaged. And I can't tell you how many times we've gotten this telephone call where the fabric wasn't feeding properly and the fabric was a little wavy. It just didn't stitch right, or the stitch length was really tight. That's a common one. So you may have it set to a 2.5 or to a 3, but looks much narrower, and that's because it is, and that's because of not having your dual feed engaged when working with a D foot. Now typically you're not going to have these issues when you're working with a foot that doesn't have that cutout in the back, that doesn't have that dual feed, is because you have a solid foot and you don't typically have an issue with narrower stitches or not feeding properly or slightly waving in the back. But side note is if you are sewing and you're noticing your fabric after it's been stitched, of course, notice your fabric is a little wavy, that can be changed, or that could be helped either with using a D foot and a dual feed, but not all machines have the built-in dual feed. So something that can help is typically what that's showing is your fabric is wavy, is it showing that your fabric is being stretched underneath the foot. So there's two things you can do. You can either use a walking foot. So here's the Bernina walking foot, and I've got video working with the Bernina walking feet. This is the case with any brand of machine. You can use a walking foot, and that's going to help pull all the layers of fabric and help prevent them from stretching as you're sewing. The other thing is you can reduce your pressure foot pressure. By reducing your pressure foot pressure, and most machines have it, some machines have it at the top, some machines have it on the side, but a lot of our Berninas are higher-end Berninas have it digitally controlled on the screen. And I'll show you in a short video of how to adjust your pressure foot pressure on most machines. All right, so to be able to adjust your pressure foot pressure to help when you're working with sewing fabric on the bias, so it's a lot stretchier in that direction. If you're working with knit fabric, to help that fabric stay flatter once it's been sewn, instead of being kind of wavy. So to adjust your pressure foot pressure on most of the machines, we'll come here where it says 50. Some machines may say 70. It's because there's a different pressure foot pressure mechanism on it. So we'll come here. And here we're going to drop our pressure foot pressure. So right now it's at 50. So if I'm working with fabric on the bias or a knit fabric, I'll probably drop that down to in the 30 range. So 30 to upper 20s. But if we're on a machine that the default pressure foot pressure is at 70, I may drop it down to the 50, upper 40 range. And you should see a noticeable difference when you're sewing to help keep that fabric flatter and less wavy. But also a walking foot or using the dual feed definitely can help with that as well. But so if you're having those waviness, you can reduce that pressure foot pressure, and it helps prevent that fabric from stretching. So the other question, another issue that a customer had this week, that was with the top thread sensor just randomly going off. So she was sewing and everything was fine. It could have been an hour or so. It wasn't something that happened right away. And she was sewing, and all of a sudden a message came up saying she was out of top thread. So sometimes we get this issue when the top thread broke, or sometimes we get this issue on a machine that doesn't have a bobbin sensor, but there's a top thread sensor. So if the machine runs out of bobbin thread and the machine's still stitching, and then it's noticing that the machine isn't pulling thread through the machine, then the top thread sensor will go off, and it'll indicate that you've ran out of bobbin thread, or that you've run out of top thread. It may have broke or something may have happened. But everything was fine. There was still plenty of bobbin thread. The machine never stopped creating stitches. The top thread was still threaded. It wasn't shredding. There was absolutely nothing wrong. So she would sew again, and then within a matter of just a few seconds, that top thread indicator, basically saying that she was out of that she was out of top thread, kept coming on. She would exit it and it'll keep coming on. So what happened here is it's nothing you can physically see, but essentially the thread has moved from where the top thread sensor is. This is not a common issue, but it moved either way, so the top thread sensor could no longer see the thread. So really the only fix for this is to rethread the top thread. Usually that's all you have to do. You usually don't have to mess with the bobbin, but you can just rethread the top. And we've seen this periodically. Some machines seem to be more prone to it than others. But the machine will still keep sewing. And so when you just rethread that top thread, everything's good. We've seen it more with lighter weight threads. We see it more often with Orfil, like Orfil 50 weight. There's nothing wrong with the thread. And it sews beautifully. It's just sometimes some threads give that error message more frequently than others. But the fix for that was just to rethread your top thread. That's all it took. So the third question that I got this week is a common issue. I shouldn't say an issue. It's a common occurrence. And it really has nothing to do with the machine. Sadly, it's got almost everything to do with the customer. But this issue isn't something that's horrible at all. But basically what it is the machine tells you that you've run out of thread, bobbin thread, before you've actually run out of bobbin thread. So I've mentioned before that the Bernina bobbin sensors are amazing. They're impeccable. They are very, very accurate. Typically, when the machine stops and it says you've run out of bobbin thread, I'll use my automatic thread cutter if I've got it, if I'm on a machine that has it, and I open and take out my bobbin case, my bobbin, and I've got maybe like 2 inches of thread left on my bobbin. Everything was perfect, nothing jammed up. I never stopped creating stitches. But there are those times where you get that message and you still have some thread on your bobbin. In this case, the machine says you've run out of bobbin, and the machine doesn't necessarily jam up, but it could cause like a little burr or a little issue underneath your fabric. So what this is, it's all about how you wound the bobbin. And I'll explain it, but I'm going to show you because it's so much easier to see it than for me to verbalize it. But basically what it is so when you're winding the thread around, so when you're winding a bobbin and you have your machine threaded for winding a bobbin, and then you take that tail, that thread, and you wrap it around your bobbin, what you don't want to do is you don't want to take that tail you have in your hand and use that thread to wrap around your bobbin. You only want the thread wrapped around your bobbin that's coming from your spool. Doesn't make a whole bunch of sense, I'm sure, but I'm going to show you what I mean by that. Okay, so here is the best way to wind your bobbin to make sure that bobbin sensor works as accurate as it possibly can. So I'm going to show you the first way, the way you really don't want to wind your bobbin. So what you want to do, so we've got our tail, so everything, the machine's threaded, ready to wind the bobbin. So you don't want to take and wrap your thread around and use this tail and wrap this tail around there. You don't want to do that. That is how you can get issues when you're at the very, very end of your bobbin. The way you want to do it is you want to take your tail with your thread and you want to hold on to it. You don't want to let any of this thread come from your grip. You just want to take it, and as you notice, you're pulling thread from the spool. And so this tail never got any shorter. If anything, it got longer. So we're going to wrap it and then cut it. So you should have a tail that may have been longer than when you originally started. You never want to let any of that thread slip from your fingers and get wrapped on there. And then at this point, you can just push it in and start winding your bobbin. But that's the best way to wind your bobbin, to make sure that your bobbin sensor and that the last bit of your thread comes off your bobbin without having it jam up at all underneath your fabric or in your machine. All right, so those are those are 3 questions that we've gotten this week, and there's always more questions coming in, and I don't want to make the videos too long. I want to make them short enough that you can watch them and enjoy them. But if you did enjoy this video and any of the other videos, please like the video. It helps other people see it. Subscribe to the channel if you're not already. Share the video with your friends, your sewing group, or whatever Facebook group you belong to, so other people, other Bernina people, other sewing people can see the videos. And also make sure you check out the merchant shop. The link's in the video description below. Some of the proceeds from the selling of the items on the Merchant shop will go and help support this channel for either equipment or other things to help bring more content to y'all. Well, as always, happy sewing.